Hello everyone and welcome to Animal Nutrition. My name is Dr. Erica Malhart and I will be your lecturer for this class this semester. My background is in veterinary medicine, specifically equine medicine. So we're going to start out the course with an intro to animal nutrition. So for every lecture, we're going to have a lecture outline where I just talk about what we will be discussing throughout the lecture. So today we will be discussing what is nutrition. So that's kind of an obvious question maybe for some of us, but we'll be a little more specific about what nutrition actually is. And then we'll get into nutritional requirements. So what do all animals require to live? And then we're going to talk a little bit about animal feed composition and feed analysis. So how do we look at feeds? How do we compare feeds? What are we looking for? How do we know how much protein a feed has, how many carbs, etc. So that's what we'll finish up with today. So what is nutrition, right? It might be a pretty obvious question, but if you think about the science of nutrition, we're actually examining the qualitative and quantitative requirements of a diet or any diet necessary to maintain proper health. And we'll talk a little bit about what proper health means in terms of energy requirements, and so we'll have a whole lecture on that. But if we remember back to kind of what qualitative versus quantitative means, right? So qualitative is kind of the what, right? So what kind of nutrition, what are the requirements? And that's what we'll talk about next, are those nutritional requirements. And then quantitatively, we're talking about how much, right? So that's really where we get into how much energy is required for maintenance, for things like that, for just survival. And we'll talk about that as well in that energy lecture. So we'll talk a little bit about essential nutrients, right? So this is kind of that qualitative requirement. What are these essential nutrients that we all need, right? And then a balanced diet, right? So we need to have those correct nutrients, but they have to be in the correct amounts as well, right? So we have, and this is kind of species dependent, we all have various needs in the different amounts of nutrients, right? And again, this is all determined so that the animal can stay healthy. And again, we'll talk a little bit about that as well. So we want this kind of balanced diet idea, right? So first, let's go through a couple of definitions and terms. So what is a nutrient, right? So this is a chemical element or compound that is in a diet or a feed that is required for normal life processes. So that's what we're going to focus on, those essential nutrients. And then we have, what's the difference between food and feed, right? So food is an edible material that provides those nutrients. And a feed is just something that we commonly use to designate animal food. So we usually don't use the word feed when we're talking about human food, right? So that's just a little bit different in terms of, human versus animal food. And so food stuff or feed stuff is material that can be made into or used as food or feed, right? So something that can be processed maybe into a feed. And then a diet is just a mixture of those feedstuffs or foodstuffs used to supply the nutrients to an animal, right? So it's just a mixture of these things. And then a ration is just the daily allocation of food or feed. So how much does that animal get per day, right? So before we get into the nitty-gritty of nutritional requirements and things like that, there's really kind of this idea of the art of feeding. And this really applies especially to you guys that are working in zoos and habitats that may or may not have multiple species at a time, exotic species. And so there's really this art of feeding where you're not really just worrying about the balanced diet, but you're worrying more about how does the animal actually acquire the food. Right? So you have to prepare these diets in a way that the animal is, one, able to eat it, and two, maybe wants to eat it, right? So all these things that are going to go into preparing a diet for an animal. You also want to present the food so that in maybe a mixed species habitat, you want the correct species to get the correct diet, right? So that can be a challenge as well. You also want the food to stay clean, so feed bowls, things like that, that you're able to present the food in a clean manner, but also keep it so that the animal wants to eat it and is able to eat it. So again, these are kind of these ideas that we'll discuss throughout the course and kind of continue in all the different lectures, but just to kind of give you an idea of this art of feeding, especially in, zoos and these exotic animal enclosures. So what are these nutritional requirements that we all need? So whether we're talking about animals or plants, we both require water and energy to survive. Now, plants are pretty lucky because they can make their own energy, which is pretty amazing if you think about it. So they can undergo photosynthesis and actually use solar energy to produce their own sugar. And so we can't do that. I wish we could, but we can't do that, right? So we have to consume our energy in the form of sugar, protein, fat, right? Those three different sources of sugar. And we call that cellular respiration. So we undergo cellular respiration by consuming sugar, and then we breathe in oxygen, and then we produce energy, right, in the form of chemical energy, or ATP, and we release heat, right? So we release heat, it's an exothermic reaction, and we produce water and carbon dioxide. And what's great about the photosynthesis is it's the complete opposite reaction. So plants are able to take in carbon dioxide and water and produce their own sugar and oxygen. And so they expire oxygen, which is why plants are so important in the world, right? So we produce carbon dioxide, they can consume it and produce oxygen, which is perfect. So this is the basic kind of equation of metabolism, right? So in one direction we have photosynthesis, and in the other direction we have cellular respiration. So as animals, we undergo cellular respiration. So this is just a picture of photosynthesis and cellular respiration, just kind of showing where these chemical reactions take place in the plant and the animal. So in the plant, we're talking about the chloroplast and photosynthesis. And in the animal, we're talking about cellular respiration in that mitochondria to produce energy. So again, just kind of hopefully a little bit of review from biology, right? So we started talking about essential nutrients, right? So what is required for most animals? Now we just said all plants and animals require energy and water. So water is obviously the #1 essential nutrient for pretty much all life, right? And then we need energy. So energy has an asterisk because we can get that energy in a couple of different ways. So we'll have a whole lecture on the differences between carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. But they are basically how we get energy into our body and into our cells, right? Now, what are the other essential nutrients? Now, we need amino acids. So proteins are made up of amino acids. So amino acids are our nitrogen source. So we need a source of nitrogen, and that's going to be those amino acids. Okay, so we're going to have some essential amino acids. We're going to have some essential fatty acids, right? So fats, lipids are made up of fatty acids, so we'll talk all about that as well. We're also going to need minerals. Okay, so there's macro minerals and micro minerals are called trace minerals. And so that has to do with the amount of the mineral that we require. So macro minerals, we require more of them, and trace or micro minerals, we don't require quite as much. We only require those trace amounts, but they're still an essential nutrient. Okay, so we'll have a whole lecture on minerals and also vitamins, right? So there are vitamins that are essential, and they can either be fat or water soluble. So what do they dissolve in? So if they dissolve in fat, they're fat soluble. If they dissolve in water, they're water soluble. And there's going to be other kind of random nutrients that we'll talk about, and that can kind of be species dependent, right? So just to name a few, such as taurine, choline, and carnitine. Okay. So we said that most animals require all of those nutrients, but what can affect these needed requirements? It can depend on the GI tract of the species, right? So that gastrointestinal tract and how they absorb nutrients and things like that. So that can definitely affect the needed requirement, right? The age of the animal, so that's our graph on the left. So if you notice, adults require a certain amount of all those things on the x-axis, such as protein, vitamin D, iron, calcium, and so on. And then if you look at a young child, right, or a young animal, is comparative, right? They need quite a bit more of those nutrients than an adult of the same species, right? So that's kind of common across the board, right? A young, growing animal is going to require a bit more nutrients than an adult animal, right, of the same species. We can also talk about level of productivity, right? So is the animal a production animal, right? So are they pregnant or lactating, especially in the dairy world, right? So this is the requirement for beef cattle, but you can definitely talk about it in the dairy cattle as well. So if you look at the far right, you can look at the lactating cow requirement versus these other, row gestating cows. Even stressed calves need a little bit more. Growing cows need a little bit more, right? So you can compare those columns and you can notice that the lactating cow requires quite a bit more of these minerals than the dry cows, right? So the non-lactating cows. So just an example, right, of how levels of productivity can affect that needed requirement. So as far as our energy sources, we said that we have a couple of different options, and so that can be species dependent as well. So depending on which species you are, you may require a different energy source or may be able to use a different energy source. So when we talk about our carnivores and omnivores, right? So carnivores specifically only eat animals, and omnivores eat plants and animals. They are going to be able to use fat and protein more so than our herbivores are really going to strictly only eat plants and use carbohydrates as energy. Now our omnivores can definitely use carbohydrates as well, so they're kind of the in-between, right? They can use all sources for energy. So that's kind of where the diets come into play of what energy source is best for that species, right? And what kind of a animal they are and what they eat. So now let's get into a little bit about animal feed composition. So animal feeds can be simple to complex, right? So mostly when you go into a feed store, you kind of look at the shelves, right? And there's so many options out there. There's so much marketing and PR for some of these brands and feeds that it's really hard to sometimes assess what's actually in an animal's feed. And not all feeds are created equal. And there are some analytical values that can definitely vary depending on laboratories and where those foods are created. And we've all heard horror stories about different companies and animal feeds that have, poisoned animals and caused problems. So that's something to just be aware of, because not all of these feeds have to go through testing and things like that. So you have to make sure that it's a well-tested laboratory and it comes from a well-tested laboratory. So again, that's kind of just something that we all learn over time, and we have to learn kind of what are the good brands and things like that. So I'm not going to, specifically talk about any one brand or another. I've just given two examples of some brands that are out there, some very popular brands. So I know Blue Wilderness has a lot of marketing, a lot of PR, but if you talk to most vets in the world, they don't recommend Blue Wilderness because they've had some problems with their nutrients in their feeds. And especially this whole grain-free movement. I'm going to talk a lot about that in a different lecture. But a lot of feeds are trying to go 100% grain-free. Your dog is like a wolf and needs just meat, right? Well, that's not true. So these grain-free diets have actually caused medical problems such as dilated cardiomyopathy, and it's a proven problem now. So again, you're going to have to watch some of this marketing and PR for some of these companies. Whereas if you look at a company like Purina, that's a very proven, reliable laboratory, you know that they're going through the appropriate testings and things like that for these diets. So not all components provide usable nutrients as well. So what do they actually put in these feeds, right? So let's talk about that. So what is actually in animal feed, right? So how do we actually assess what is in these products? So number one, right, there's going to be water in the animal feed, some amount, right? And we call that moisture, okay? And then two, we have the dry matter, okay? So what is the dry matter made of? It's going to be made up of organic material and inorganic material. And the inorganic material they also refer to as ash, okay? So what makes up that organic material? Well, these are going to be your proteins, or those nitrogen-containing amino acids, right? You're going to have lipids, which are fat-soluble. You're going to have carbohydrates, water-soluble, and you're going to have your vitamins that are both maybe fat and water-soluble. Right, so that's going to be the organic material. So if you think back to organic chemistry, what is an organic compound, right? We're going to talk about that in another lecture, kind of your carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, hydrogen, all those organic compounds, right? So that's your organic material. Then you're going to have your inorganic material. These are your minerals, right? So minerals are usually metals, okay? So lots of metals are minerals. And so you have these macro elements and micro elements or micro minerals, okay? So that's also in your dry matter. And when you talk about the inorganic material and these minerals, any mineral can be toxic in excessive amounts, and sometimes that's what happens if you hear about a diet causing toxicity. It can be sometimes a mineral. Okay, so minerals you have to be careful with, especially those micro or trace minerals. And we'll talk about that when we get to that lecture. So where does the organic material come from, right? So we're talking about the protein, the fats, the carbohydrates, the vitamins, right? And they're coming from plants and animals. So what is the composition of plants and animals? If we're talking about plants, we're mostly talking about water and carbohydrates, right? So when we're talking about carbohydrates, you're talking about those readily available sugars, right? Simple sugars that we'll talk about, and the fibrous components of carbohydrates, or those crude protein, cellulose, that's harder to break down, right? So we call them fiber, right? So we all know that there's plants out there that are high in fiber, right? And some are high in sugar. And so that's the same thing, right? These simple sugars versus complex sugars and fibers. But they're low in protein and fat, right? So high in carbs, low protein and fat. Now, if you're talking about animals, animals are mostly fat and protein, right? So obviously they have water as well. So both plants and animals are mostly water, but you get 20% fat, 16% protein, and some minerals as well. So you got to remember they have some minerals, because especially when you're talking about whole animals, you're talking about bones too, and that's very important when we're talking about this whole idea of a balanced diet, and especially for those exotic animals, right? Feeding whole animals is very important. But they're low in carbs, right? So less than 1% carbohydrates. So this is the organic material that we're putting into our animal feed. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as well later when we talk about feeds. So now we're going to talk a little bit about how we actually analyze animal feed. And the process is called approximate analysis. So essentially it's an analytical method to assess and compare feedstuffs. And it's proximate, meaning it's not exact. So usually it gives you a percent of the animal feed that is that certain nutrient. So a couple of terms that we need to get into our head when we're talking about nutrition and diets and proximate analysis is dry matter feed versus as fed. So dry matter, you're only talking about the dry matter. That's the organic and inorganic material. You remove the moisture from the diet. And that's a really good way to be able to compare diets. So we'll talk about comparing diets on a dry matter basis, it's called. Versus as fed means just that. It's how the food is fed. So it has the moisture in it, it has everything in it. So you're not removing anything. So that's an as fed diet, okay? So there's two different matters of thought here. But usually we want to compare diets on a dry matter basis. It gives you a better accurate assessment. So then we have to figure out what else is in there, right? So if you get your dry matter, you take out your moisture, how much is protein, right? So that's your crude protein. How much is fat, right? So an ether extract. And then you look at your ash, which is the inorganic materials, right? Your minerals. And then you have crude fiber, right? So we said fiber is a carbohydrate, right? So you can figure out how much is fiber. And then they have what's called a nitrogen-free extract. So we'll talk a little bit about that, where you actually remove the nitrogen. And so it's a way of looking at protein without the nitrogen. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about how we actually get these different values, okay? And so on the right hand side, I have kind of a flow chart here of how they actually go through this approximate analysis process. And so you're going to dry the food, right? So you're going to get all the moisture out so that you have a moisture-free sample. You're going to go through a process that gives you the protein. That's the Kjeldahl process. Okay, I know that's a weird word. You don't need to know these processes for this class, okay? You just need to know what the approximate analysis is, what we use it for, things like that. And then you're going to do an ether extraction. So that way you have this fat-free residue. So you remove the fat, right? So you remove the fat. So we removed the protein. We've removed the fat. Now you're left with essentially the inorganic material, the ash, and the carbohydrates, right? Or the fiber. So then you separate, you burn it, you burn off all that fiber, the organic material, and you're left with the inorganic ash. That's why they refer to it as ash, because they actually burn it, and then what's left is your inorganic material. Okay, so this is just kind of a simplified kind of flow diagram for the approximate analysis. So this just talks through a little bit about what we already discussed through this approximate analysis. So how do we get that percent crude protein? And essentially it's this Kjeldahl method of removing the nitrogen containing material, which is our protein. Right, so then if you remove that material, that's going to be your percent of crude protein out of that feed. And then the same thing with the ether extract, right? It's the percent of fats. So you're going to remove the fats and the fatty acids from the feed using a method with ether, right? Ether extraction. And this is really the very high caloric value material, right? So we know that fat is high in calories, right? Provides lots of energy. And so that's the percent ether extract. And then again, that percent of ash is all that kind of material that's left after you've burned off all the organic material. And this is really your minerals, okay? And so this is just, just to kind of go through what those processes are again, but you again don't need to know the exact processes of how they get these different values, okay? I just want you to know what they are and what they mean, right? So there's one last value we need to talk about, and that's the nitrogen-free extraction. So I think a lot of people get a little confused about the NFE, or nitrogen-free extraction. So we know what the crude fiber is, right? So we said crude fiber is the carbohydrates, but this is really the structural carbohydrates, the kind of indigestible portion of the plant. So this is the cellulose, okay? So crude fiber, it's in the name, right? It's fiber. Most of us kind of know what fiber is, right? Plants that are high in fiber. So these are really those indigestible carbohydrate portions. And of course, there are animals out there, such as ruminants and a lot of herbivores, that are able to digest fiber and cellulose, right, with the help of bacteria, things like that. And we'll talk about that when we get to our carbohydrate lecture. But really the crude fiber, think of it as the indigestible carbohydrates, okay? Whereas the nitrogen-free extract is essentially the digestible carbohydrate portion of the diet, or our sugars, essentially, okay? And so how do we actually get the NFE, or the nitrogen-free extract, is we have to subtract everything else that we just talked about, okay? So it's the difference between that original sample weight of the feed, right, and the sum of the water, right, because we've removed moisture, the ether extract, which is our fat, our crude protein, our crude fiber, and finally that ash, right? So if we remove all of that stuff we've already just measured, then that difference is going to be our nitrogen-free extract, which is the digestible carbohydrate portion of the diet. And that's important, right? Because we know that sugar is a very important energy source, right? So that's what we're trying to get, is that percent of nitrogen-free extract, or think of it percent of sugar. You can even call it that if you want to mentally think of it that way, right? Because that's that digestible kind of simple sugar carbohydrate portion. Okay? So now there's another term called a guaranteed analysis. So we just talked about the approximate analysis, and that's kind of the process of how you analyze what is in a feed, right? And it gives you a percent of the different nutrients in the feed. Now, a guaranteed analysis is an example of an as-fed food label of information, right? So this is what you're actually going to be looking at when you look at the back of animal feed bag, right? So this is what you're actually looking at, right? So this is an as-fed example. So it's not dry matter, but it has the moisture in it as well. So what did we say? As fed includes the moisture, right? So that's a guaranteed analysis. And this is not precise, right? So just like we said, the approximate analysis is not really precise. It gives you kind of a percent. So a lot of the times these even give you a range of what's in the food. So it may say a minimum of this or a maximum of this. So it's definitely not precise. And so you have to keep that in mind, unless you're talking about minerals, okay, and vitamins. So vitamins and minerals, they tend to be precise because of the problem with toxicity, right? So there is a chance that, you want to be exact with the vitamins and minerals because they can be toxic, right? Especially if you're talking about things like selenium. Selenium has a very narrow safety margin, okay? So things like that where you want to make sure you have the exact amount. But if you look at the other things in here, usually you say, okay, well, if we look at calcium, right, there's a minimum, there's a maximum, or just a minimum, right? So a lot of these are minimums, right? So there's a minimum of this in there, or a maximum of that, okay? And so even they'll say, this thing isn't an essential nutrient, it's just an added thing in the diet, but most things are essential nutrients, essentially, in the diets, okay? So these are guaranteed analyses, okay, of the food. So now, how do we actually compare diets and the nutrients within those diets? So we said that the approximate analysis kind of gives you the numbers for everything that's in there, but they're still percents, right? And then we said the as-fed guaranteed analysis is what you actually are looking at on the diet. So if you turn over and look at the label and you want to compare, maybe a dry food versus a wet food for a cat or a dog, and you want to see, okay, well, how much protein is actually in these two diets, or how much fat is actually in these diets, because maybe you want, a diet that has higher protein in it for some, maybe a medical reason or something like that. So how do we actually compare them? Okay. And we call these dry matter calculations, or as-fed conversions. So essentially we want to compare the diets on a dry matter basis. So what does that mean? Because the guaranteed analysis is as-fed, right? So it has the moisture in it. So to convert it to dry matter, you remove the moisture content from the feedstuffs to get that dry matter value, okay? So it's a common way to compare feeds on this dry matter basis, right? So why don't we go through an example of how we actually do this? And I'm going to use a marker here on the PowerPoint, and hopefully you'll be able to see it, okay? Because what happens is if you just look at the diet at the guaranteed analysis, so say we have a dry food, right, a cat food that's a dry food, it says it's 30% protein, 10% moisture, right? And then we look at the canned food, and it says 9% protein but 78% moisture. Now we want to compare the protein, and that looks pretty obvious, right? Well, it looks like the dry food has more protein because it says it has 30% protein versus only 9% protein. But if you look at the moisture difference, that canned food or wet food has a lot more moisture, so it throws off that value of the protein, right? So first thing we have to do is we have to take moisture out. So let's call the dry food diet A, right, and the canned food diet B. So if we go through and remove our moisture out of A, so it's in percents, right? So we want to remove the moisture. So say we have 100%, right? Since it's in percents, we want to remove that 10% moisture, and we're left with 90%, right? Okay. Now, if we go back to our diet B, if we remove the moisture, we say we have 100%, and we're going to remove our moisture, which is 78%, and we're left with 22%. Okay. Now, how do you actually compare the protein? Okay. So, if we do a ratio, right, we're going to have to kind of solve for x. So this is going to be where kind of some math comes into play. And again, if you have any trouble with doing any of these math problems or anything like that, I would be more than happy to meet with you guys on Zoom or come to office hours, right? And I can go through these practice problems and things, and I'll give you guys more practice problems to work through on how to actually do the math, right? So we're going to have to do a ratio essentially, right? So for our dry food, we say we have 30% protein. So we're going to do 30%, right? But it's going to be out of 90, not out of 100, right? Because we've removed our moisture. Now that's going to be an X amount out of 100. That's what we're looking for. We're looking for that actual amount of protein, and that's X. So we want to solve for X, right? So we do our cross multiplication, right? Which is 90 times X equals 30 times 100, right? So 3,000. Okay, and then you solve for x by dividing by 90, right? Sorry, it's getting a little squished here at the bottom. Okay, so if we have our calculator, right, x equals 33.3 essentially in change. So x equals 33%. Okay. So that's how much protein is actually in there. And that makes kind of sense that it's a little bit higher, but not too much because we have only 10% moisture. Now let's do the same thing for our wet food, okay? So we have 9% protein, but that's out of 22 instead of out of 100. So 9 out of 22, okay, equals our value we're looking for, out of 100, right? So we cross multiply. That's 22x equals 900. Okay, so we're going to divide by 22 to solve for x. So what does x equal, right? And that's going to be approximately 40 to 41%, 40.9, so we can say 41% if we round up, okay? And so if you actually compare it, our diet B, or the canned food, actually has more protein in it, right? So it actually has 41% protein versus our dry food has 33% protein, right? So if we didn't do that, if we didn't compare them on a dry matter basis, you would just kind of assume that, okay, the dry food says it has 30% protein, right? So that just, but you can't compare those numbers because it's not a value, right? It's a percent of the diet. So you have to take moisture into account. You have to remove the moisture from the as fed value into the dry matter basis. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. I know it was a little sloppy on there with the PowerPoint, but again, if you have questions on how to do the math, anything like that, let me know and we can walk it through, okay, step by step. Okay. So that's pretty much it for this lecture. I have a lot of nutritional resources for you guys that are really good things to look up. You know, you can find interesting articles, reviewed journals, publications, very good stuff. And also the AFCO is kind of the, you know, it's this nonprofit corporation that essentially defines ingredients and things like that that are used in pet food. So AFCO, if you see, you know, the AFCO approved foods, it means it's gone through some sort of process of evaluation. So the National Academy of Press is really good for kind of nutrient requirements. So you can look up different species and what their nutrient requirements are. PubMed, right? You can look for nutritional information on PubMed, which are all reviewed journals. And then AFCO, of course, has all of their kind of things and how they review feeds and things like that. So it's kind of interesting to look through AFCO. So these are just some websites for you that you aren't required to go through, but good references. Okay. So next week we'll be talking about energy. Okay. So we talked a lot about, you know, we require energy. It's one of our nutritional requirements, but we can get energy in many different forms. But what is energy and how do we talk about energy in the realm of nutrition? Right? Because mostly we're talking about digestible energy, which is what we're actually absorbing into our body and using in our cells. Okay, so it's chapter 10 in the textbook, and that's energy. Thanks a lot. I'll see you guys next week.